we are going to have Doug here today, this morning, and then we'll be meeting again from 5 to 6, if that works for you. And he can let us know what he's going to cover from 5 to 6, and then tomorrow morning at 9:15. So, Doug?
Yep.
Thank you, John, and wow, I got to say thanks to anybody that would get up on Saturday morning and come to one of these things, invest your time. So I really appreciate the fact that you all are all here and have shown an interest in this, especially a subject that for many people, when you say spiral dynamics, believe me, I've been doing this for a long time, and when you first introduce that term to people, the very first thing is, what in the world's that got to do with the Bible? You know. So, as we go through this for the first time, one of the things I want to make sure that we do is keep this interactive. And my experience has been that as I go through things, I try to take my time and see if there's questions, thoughts that you may have to interject, that things that you may say, I see this correlating to this or whatever. People are usually, especially at the beginning, very hesitant they're thinking it, but they're afraid to say, I have a thought. So that's very common. So if anybody wants to be an icebreaker and ask something, so everybody else, because what happens a lot of times is somebody will ask a question, and then there'll be like 4 or 5 other people in the group who are like, yeah, that's what I was thinking. You know. So, I want this to be interactive. I'd first of all like to say thank you so much to John and the BCM ministry here, all of you, for this invitation. Danae is my wife. Yes, see, who gets the applause, right? That's why I bring her. I'm no dummy. It's Danae with a D, like Renee, just with a D, Danae. And she and Dinah have already commiserated about names, and so it's the same thing. It's Dinah, yes, and it's Danae. So we've got that. But what a wonderful history. I really appreciate the fact that I've had a chance to meet Tim, who has been a long time counterpart here with John, and to hear the history of how the building started and what thinking was already here in the 70s percolating, and the fact that so much has evolved on what most people would call the infamous bleeding edge, in my mind. In other words, your openness to new thinking is really a leading edge of the evolution of spiritual consciousness, as we'll see as we study spiral dynamics. So I just want to say thank you to all of you here and to express my appreciation for the great work that's been put into this over the years. And I have a lot of respect for that. So spiral dynamics, who gives a rip? Well, here's the deal. Danae and I love spiral dynamics. We love the Enneagram. Now the cool thing is we already know that most of you here know about the Enneagram. And a lot of you even know your Enneagram number. Some of you may not. But the reason these kinds of models are important to us is because they have to mean something to our marriage relationship. They have to mean something to the way we communicate with kids who are now, we call them kids, but they're now between 37 and 45, and there's 4 of them. And now 5 grandchildren growing up. Hadley at 4, all the way out to Leon, who has now become our first teenager. And so we know that Danae will be busy talking with Mom for the next 5 years. So if it doesn't mean something, you know, this is not just like a head thing, you know, where you want to maybe checkmate somebody on your view of something or something like that. It's not a head, it's not a head game. It integrates the head and the heart. And the integration of our head and our heart will manifest in what they call hands. So you have head, heart, and hands. Hands really relates to the way we make use of this, which is a form of activism. Even if you're using it in your marriage or in your parenting or whatever, hands is, a form of activism, the way that it's working out. Now, spiral dynamics itself is purely a historical model that relates to worldviews. And this is a developmental study, much like if you were to get in childhood psychology. You would find what? You find that kids are ready for certain concepts at kindergarten, certain concepts in the first grade, second grade. It's developmental. What spiral dynamics came into being for and about was that globally, all human cultures have gone through these stages, and that no culture ever has or can skip a stage. Well, that's fascinating. And the people who have studied this are sociologists, anthropologists, historians, a collection of people that have really put the material together that later became known and coined as spiral dynamics. This model is not a religious model. It's just purely a socio-historical worldview model. You're familiar with the term like culture wars, the culture wars. You see the difference between generations and the way they think. You see how things are different today than the way it used to be, etc. That's really what we're going to get into. And what's really helpful is when you can see how, number one, what we're going to do is we're going to see that this first and foremost applies to the biblical narrative. I'm going to go through how these stages all show up in the narrative in the right order. That's what got my attention, because I spend all my time 24/7 with our nonprofit called Presence. You can find us at presence.tv. This is what I do all the time. And I love talking about the biblical narrative. We're proposing that the biblical narrative has great potential for the future that's getting ready to come out. And as you hear what I have to say and the number of different people and groups outside of even religion that are beginning to hear about theology in a whole new context that still honors the narrative itself, doesn't do away with anything or take things out of, you'll see that there's great potential and great wisdom in the model. That Jesus, God, those concepts can be far greater than where we see them even today. That's our proposal. Now, one of the things I think is key to a really good presentation, when I do a good presentation, is that first and foremost, I don't leave my notes in the bag, Danae, in my laptop bag. Please bear with me, I'm now 71. So no, yeah, I left them in there. We were trying to get the mic system working and all that, and I guess I got distracted. There should be in a side pocket there somewhere. On the outside. Very good. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. You also notice I've got a cane. I've had a left hip replacement, so I'm on the other side rehab. So sometimes you may see me walking around with a cane. Sometimes I'm standing and walking. And so that's why the cane. I'm on the other side of it. Won't be long till I don't need that. So, it's a historical model. It developed gradually because there were people like English mathematician Alfred North Whitehead who began seeing, he died in the early 50s, he began seeing this developmental pattern that seemed to be happening in different eras of history and that they were consistent. And from him forward, there was William James and Gebser and others who began developing these levels, but they were not as clear as what we're going to see today because they were developmental. I'm just saying this to say this didn't come out of a vacuum. Many people have, from all over the world, have contributed to what became spiral dynamics. The model itself really came about in the late 60s, Dr. Clare Graves, who began to put this together. The reason he was able to put these things together is you can't understand all these levels unless all these levels have already existed or do exist. So in other words, if you were living back in Israel and you were part of the 12 tribes, there wasn't anybody that was saying, hey, what do you think about this tribal era, this tribal worldview? Nobody knew that. These eras initially were thought of as just the way it is. This is just the way it is. And of course, if someone comes along and suggests, well, what if things were different than what you're saying the way things are? That leads to conflict. You may never have had conversations like that with people who hold views that are different than the views you hold. So we're going to talk about that and how that works. So the spiral model became popularized literally by Dr. Don Beck, who co-authored the book Spiral Dynamics. If you are a person who likes to do research, let's say you were 5, I'm just throwing that out as an example, you would probably enjoy reading the book Spiral Dynamics, because it's like the Enneagram. Yeah, first you learn your number and then you find out there's all this depth to it. It goes way down, motivations and instincts and stances and et cetera, et cetera. And the same is true with the spiral. What we're going to do is introductory, and it will be plenty, first of all, for you to get a good understanding of what this is doing, what it's saying, and how it can be used, and whether or not you see the value of it, and how it's applied to the biblical narrative, and why we not only are going to apply it first up to the time of the first century, but we're then going to trace these worldviews after Jesus and the apostolic writers left the scene. What happened? And what happened with the interpretation of the scriptures? And see the spiral, the beauty of the spiral, and again, another why I was attracted to this. What is it that has brought about thousands of denominations that exist today? A difference of interpretations. You have a wide variety of differences in interpretations that lead to some type of boundaries that define that denomination. One of the things that I do a lot and have done for the last 2 decades is our presence location is in Atlanta. And one of the things that we've done is entertain pastors, priests, people from Catholic, Protestant, Calvinists, Arminians, Pentecostalists. What's happening is these pastors are feeling constrained by the boundaries of their particular denomination. They're thinking outside that, right? Outside the box. Well, what's the problem? Doug, they will say, how can I get my congregation to move forward toward some things I'm seeing without losing my job? That's a big deal. I got kids in college. We've got a house now. We've got bills. You know, this is what I do. What would I do if I lost my job because I went outside the boundaries? Which is why we all know what a heretic is. That's how you become a heretic. And I was bragging last night to John and company that I've been a heretic since the 70s. So I hate to brag about that. And I had the feeling in talking to he and Tim that they may have experienced some of that themselves. So the spiral model, I find out about it, read Spiral Dynamics, I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is a historical model. Well, what's the Bible? It's presenting the story of God through history. I mean, we're starting all the way back to the beginning of humanity and the genesis of the story. And we're moving all the way up to the 1st century. And we're going through many centuries in doing that. And so I began looking at this and I was so attracted. So what I did was I reached out to Don Beck, who wrote the book, Spiral Dynamics. Don was kind enough to spend a weekend with us in Atlanta. So he has since passed. I got to meet with Don. Now, Don was famous for a lot of reasons that had nothing to do with religion. One of the most famous things he had done was that when Mandela was imprisoned, and then shortly thereafter, Don made 26 trips to South Africa, talking to Nelson Mandela while he was in prison and afterwards about cultural worldview conflict. Because he knew that Mandela was going to try to unite the country. And apartheid, we all know the history of South Africa and that difficulty. So Don suggested to Mandela that one of the things he used this a lot, to unite people was sports. And if any of you are sports fans, I don't care what it is, football or basketball or soccer or anything in sports, you have this stadium of people. Let's take football. You have this stadium of people. And it's the temple to which all the fans come, right? And they have their colors. And they're all ready for their team. And the team scores a touchdown. In unison, everyone's on their feet, they're screaming, they're yelling, they're high-fiving. No one says, oh, wait a minute, what political party are you? Oh, wait a minute, what religion are you? What denomination are you? Blah, 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 blah. Nobody's doing that. Everybody's going nuts, all right? Because that's a unifier. And that is the way they are participating in coming together. And Don knew that, so he suggested that they do that with the South African rugby team because it was only white. The South Africa, it was just like when we had Jackie Robinson breaking through in baseball, and then the same type things here with race. The same things were happening. So there was a movie made called Invictus. If you have ever heard of Invictus or ever seen the movie, it's about Mandela using these principles to integrate the South African rugby team and thereby bring more unity to the South African people. Now from there, Don went all over the world. He worked with people at The Hague in Amsterdam. That's the international seat of justice for the UN. He worked there with Anne-Marie Voorhoeve and Dr. Peter Merry, who I've had conversations with that we'll get to tomorrow about where's this all going, and my excitement about where the biblical narrative is going in my personal life with people that otherwise have had no interest when you bring up Bible. But now when it's presented in the way that I'm going to present it, and how it can be used like a Rosetta Stone where you're making contact and communicating with them in their government subject or their science subject or their arts or their music or whatever, and you're seeing that it's all coming from the same principles. It's almost like God's in everything, you know? And so this is a model that's really exciting to me that came through Don. While we were visiting that weekend, I come to find out that Don was a graduate of Abilene Christian College. Well, that was a sister college to the college I went to, Harding College. They were both from the denomination Church of Christ, similar to Christian Church or Disciples of Christ. And if you've ever had any engagement with those of us that came from the Church of Christ, the one thing I was thankful for every day was that I was in the denomination that had the truth. Man, what a break, right? I mean, I could have been born something else. I could have been a Baptist for Pete's sake. So then we headed off. So I'm talking to Don, and the reason I had him here is I wanted to present my views in theology. Well, you don't even know if someone really knows much about the Bible at all. So it's like the kind of conversation you're going to have depends on how much they know or don't know about theology or the biblical narrative. Well, he was tuned in. By the time we got done this with the weekend, the thing that really helped jettison my work in this was that Don, I really miss him. He was saying, hey, you've got to take this somewhere. You've got to get this message out, Doug. This is great stuff. So by doing that, I got introduced to a lot of people. I was telling the folks last night, for example, if you've ever heard of Spencer Burke. Spencer Burke out in California had a conference he was putting together. And it was on progressive thinking. He had Rob Bell there, if you've ever heard of Rob Bell, and he had Don Beck there speaking, and Don was like, you've got to get Doug King here. So by that, I went out and I spoke, and I met Spencer, and I met Rob Bell and his wife, and got to know them and some other people, and all of a sudden, what Presence was saying was getting out there. You know, I mean, you start out, and John, you made a great comment last night. When you start out with new paradigm thinking, and you're having difficulty getting anyone to listen to what you're having to say, you can question yourself. Am I nuts? Am I crazy? You know, maybe I'm off in this. Well, I begin to get validation. So that's just to give you a brief history of the spiral model and the fact that it is a very valid model and it has a great history. Right now, in the spiral, I've met with people in different circles who come from global finance. They are international business consultants, usually Fortune 500 consultants. Because why? Because Fortune 500 companies open up offices in all different parts of the world. And they know that you can't go into this part of the world or that part of the world with your cultural worldview ideas and say, you all can relax. I'm here to tell you the way it is. You know, you can't do that. And if you're going to conduct business over there, you need to understand the culture and how they're thinking and how it all works. There's also people that use it in philosophy and, again, the arts and in many other places. So, again, this is just a little background. Now, you all have your obligatory handout. Yeah. You are looking at a handout that has these different levels. I'll explain why they're levels and why they're colors and all that good stuff. One of the first things I'm going to say is that the importance of each worldview is that each worldview addresses the values of ultimate concern. And what you're going to see is that the values of ultimate concern change and actually bring about the next worldview. And that process is always one where there's resistance. It's the old saying, nobody likes change, even when it's for the best. And so it addresses change and being open to change. And I'll also speak about where you need to be on the spiral in order to be open versus closed. You guys get an A+. So you're good. We may have a star or something we can give them. So, matters of ultimate concern. And as you go up the spiral, you can see that the spiral gets wider. And this is because when we start with human consciousness in the earliest stages, not a lot of complexity there. But as human populations grew, the complexity increased. And when complexity increases, that begins to produce situations that are, and here's a key spiral word, unworkable. The unworkable, that's a key component of your evolution. That's why you think what you think today, because you've gone through your life and you've had times when you begin to encounter things that were unworkable. Maybe you used to belong to a different group or a denomination that you were in that at some point you said, there are things that I just disagree with. I'm really feeling a disconnect now with this particular, I'm going to find another church. Maybe you've gone through that. Well, what that is that you have encountered the unworkable. I have a lot of dad jokes. Maybe you've heard this. There was a guy who was on a deserted island. A ship had come by. He had gotten their attention. They landed on the island. He was so thankful and everything else. And how he told them how he survived and everything. And they saw over on the side, he had built this structure out of palm leaves and branches and everything else. And they said, what is that? And he said, oh, that's where I go to church. This is where I go to church. And they were like, oh, that's really fascinating. And then they were going to leave, and they looked to the other side of the island, and they saw another one just like it, and they said, what is that structure? He said, oh, that's where I used to go to church. You won't remember anything about the spiral, but you'll tell all your friends. Also, as you go up the spiral, the rate of change increases, it becomes quicker and quicker. In our lifetime, let's just talk about if you remember when you got your first iPhone. And you were so excited until 6 months later it was outdated. Or you got your laptop and the software changed. You need a new software. The rate of change, that also brings complexity. I mean, it's hard to deal with quicker rates of change. And I don't know if you've ever gotten these emails, but I've gotten many emails over the years. There will always be somebody, or maybe on Facebook or something, that say, remember the good old days when everything was so simple when we were growing up? You know, it wasn't crazy like it is today, and what young people are thinking today, and it was just such an easier, gentle time, and blah, 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 blah. And so it's like, well, Grandma, wasn't that when Hitler was trying to dominate the world? You know, I'm not sure how simple the times were. It's just that when you encounter more complicated times, the times that preceded that seem to be simpler times. And that's what we all want. We want safety and stability. That's where the spiral starts in our cave, safety and stability. One final thing I'll say as we go along here is that all these worldviews produce both healthy and unhealthy manifestations. And it doesn't mean that this developmental, because I had people that were history specialists, I had to make sure and explain, it wasn't a smooth, every culture just went smoothly from one to the other, you know, to the next worldview. There's been regression. You have this Roman Empire that did all these amazing things and invented all these amazing things, and then shortly thereafter we end up in the Dark Ages. Regression. So regression is a part of history as well. Nonetheless, even when there's regression, the spiral keeps on going. And the evolution that I'm talking about here is what I understand to be the evolution of spirit, manifested through the human that came from that spirit. It is a story of our human growing up, a story that says I'm growing toward the infinite. Therefore, I know that growth is something that is my nature. It doesn't end because I'll never be the infinite. That means I'm always going to be growing, and I should be willing to think about, look at things that are different, consider the views. It doesn't mean that I accept them. I may be saying things here today you don't accept. That's fine. I don't make those things a condition of God acceptance. I will tell you that right off the top. So because somebody might disagree with my view of this, that, or the other, or if you have something that you think, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right, again, raise your hand. And I won't ask you to leave unless it's real serious. Seriously though, that's a big thing about the spiral. So we see that there are these nice, colorful worldviews called first tier. Then there's at the top this thing called second tier / integral. I'm going to talk about the first tier world levels this morning in 2 sessions. So keep an eye on the time. We'll break this up where you can get some coffee to see if you can get through the second session and get a bite to eat, stretch, and all that good stuff. So we're going to divide that in 2. I'm going to do the first part of these levels now, and then the second part. Tonight is when I'm going to get into what happens when we get into a second tier viewpoint. I will say that initially, all first tier worldviews are going to share some things in common, and that the changes that happen in history through first tier are changes of degree. When you move into or take the evolutionary leap into an integral perspective, it is a difference of kind. And I'll explain what I mean by that. And it's fascinating because that's where I really get into some juicy scripture stuff. And we're gonna talk about parts of the Bible that maybe, depending on your background, you've spent some time in, no time in, a lot of time in. But the thing I love about this is that it has allowed me to go from Genesis through John's Revelation and see one unified, amazing story about the evolution of spiritual consciousness with regard to God identity. That is the outcome of the book, the narrative as I see it. I do not see the narrative as a book whose outcome is 2 world religions. Okay? So we'll say, what do you mean by that? I don't see God saying, Father Abraham, I could make 3 world religions out of him. Yeah. I don't see that as God nature. So we're going to question that. And the good thing is, we have a ticket to go home tomorrow. And I always make sure there's not a door behind me. Now, let's go ahead and make sure that, yes, one other thing I want to talk about these colors. Why do they use colors? Because these colors are going to represent a value stack that comes with each one. And it's an easy way for consultants to speak of people in terms of value memes, value memes, meaning what your values are. We all have values. I mean, if I sat down and talked to any of you about that are married, or you have your children, or you're raising children, or whatever, well, you've got some kind of values that hold your relationships together. That's your worldview of how it affects your marriage and parenting and all those things. The different colors represent the lens through which people look to interpret a narrative. Isn't it interesting that we have thousands of denominations? One narrative. Same narrative. Well, what's the question? The question is, why do you interpret it that way? And you're a Catholic and you're a Protestant. Why are you a Baptist and why are you a Mormon? And, it's the same narrative. It's a matter of interpretation. These are lenses through which people look. I like to quote the English poet Alexander Pope. He said it this way: all looks infected that the infected spy, as all looks yellow to the jaundiced eye. What he was saying is the lens through which we look will determine the way we interpret the world and our world view. So we'll get into questions as we get up here on your spiral. Jesus is going to show up there in blue in the traditional age, which I'll talk about in a little bit, probably part 2. Well, in the history of the church, what we're going to see is that we've had blue Jesus, we've had orange Jesus, and we've had green Jesus. And I'm going to ask, what would an integral Jesus look like? And that's where I'm going to propose that we use the same narrative, but it, in my mind, really opens the biblical narrative to the world. And I'll explain how and why, and from my own direct experiences. So these are lenses through which we look. Let's start with archaic. The archaic, Carrie, it's beige. Yeah, we talked about it last night, yes. So we talked about trying to remember these colors. You see, this is the first time most of you have heard about the spiral. I know that. When I first heard this, look, I was just like you are today. I'm like, wait a minute now. What color is this and what's that and what does that world do? I'm aware of that, so I'm keeping this on a level that you would want to begin with, and at the same time understanding. You may need to say, now, wait a minute, what about this, that, or the other? Because it's like an Enneagram. 9 numbers, what are those? Wait a minute, what's a 6? That kind of thing. So it's all cool, it's all good. Archaic, what are the values of archaic? Pretty dadgum simple. Safety, security, and survival. That's where humans started. Surviving. And our ancestors did a really good job of it, or none of us would be here. Safety, security, and survival really tie us at the beginning of human history to all the other animal species on the planet. In that sense, we have the same animal instincts as all the other species on the planet. Survive. And that safety and security is something that we will always have to this very day inside of us. If my life is threatened, I'm not worried about what I'm going to do next week or what vacation I'm heading out to do. I mean, with safety and survival, right, you forget. That is it. You put your own oxygen mask on first. You even learn that on the airplane. Hold on, I got to help little Billy. No, you got to survive, and then you help little Billy. And then you put on the mask for little Billy. So that is an instinct we have, and I see this being introduced, and when I started studying this, I said, oh, that to me is archaic Adam. We start with archaic in the biblical narrative. And who do we start with? Adam. What were his safety, instinctive survival things? Well, Adam had a concern about survival just like me, and he had an instinctive self just like I do. What we're going to find as we go through these worldviews is that they're common to everybody. And now we're going to talk about how and why. But for Adam, the instinctive self had a desire in the metaphorical story. And in that metaphorical way of telling the story and starting the genesis of the narrative, in the beginning of the narrative, it seems that Adam wanted to be like God. That's what started it all. He wanted to be like God. Now, you can't be like something unless you are exactly like that something. To be like God meant he wanted the same protective power for his survival, his safety, his security as God. He wanted to be like God. And this is why he craved the very thing he was told not to do. Which is what always happens when you have a kid, God finds out. You tell them no, and what's the first thing they do? So Adam has an instinctive self, and that's an inward pull. It is self-centered because it is a God-given instinct. All of the worldviews and the values that I'm going to talk about, they're God-given. Our instincts are God-given. They're not bad. all the instincts we have, they're not bad. Now we get into, but what would be a healthy versus an unhealthy outcome? If I'm all about me and someone says, well, he's self-centered, we all have a picture of what that means, So the instinctive self inside of Adam is really what starts this. And I will bring up some just brief points because I want to bring the theology in. There's so much to this, I can't do it all. But that's one of the factors. The other is that Adam and Eve, and I don't have time to talk about the parallels of Adam and Eve moving all the way through, but they experienced exile. And that exile was also necessary. It was necessary. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't a fall. It was part of a necessary process. Because without that, Adam would never have known what the concept of separation was. Separation is at the heart of the entire narrative, all the way up to Christology. Why? Because separation equals death. To be separated from God, that is bringing about the concept of death. Death is not just, it's biological, obviously, but in the narrative, what we're going to find is death takes on a God meaning. If you go all the way out to the first century in the parable of the prodigal son, it's there that the father says when the son returns and is united and the separation is over, the father says, this my son was dead, now he is alive. And nothing to do with his biology. All in Adam are dead. What does that mean? That's Paul. All in Adam are dead. Well, that has to do with God's separation. That has to be overcome. When I go out to the work of Christology, I also find Paul saying, Jesus is the last Adam. Bookends. Adam is alive and well. Jesus couldn't be the last Adam if Adam wasn't alive and well in humanity. What is it? It's instinctive survival. It's wanting to be like God. We'll talk a lot more about that as we get into the integral side of this. So, when we get out to Jesus and he is looking at all the things that came before him, he points out another principle of spiral dynamics. Unfortunately, Jesus didn't have our chart, so he could have done a lot more with it if he had our chart. So you guys are so fortunate. One of the main principles is that each of these worldviews develop. They both transcend the previous worldview and include elements of the previous worldview. So one of the spiral principles is transcend and include. So what does Jesus say when he comes on the scene? I did not come to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill. That's a transcend and include spiral dynamic principle. And they're all over the biblical narrative. And these are the kind of things I can use to talk with people who don't come from the biblical narrative to show that the biblical narrative is really a mirror image of nothing less than the spiral dynamics of worldviews as they have evolved in history. And for me, that really brings a great validation. So let's go to tribal. The tribal V-meme is purple. That is purple. So the values in tribe have to do with collectives. Tribes are collectives. We've moved from the individual, me, instinctive Adam, self-centered, go to tribal. Now we're like, well, what about the values of who I am in a collective? As it said, no man is an island. My identity, who I am, is not just determined by my instinctive self in a vacuum. Who I am is determined by collectives that I belong to. my tribes. It starts with genealogy. Genealogy, we all know, is huge in the story of the first tier. Begat, 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 begat. Well, what's that about? That's identity. Tribal identity. That's huge. Genealogy is huge. We'll see how Jesus turns that on its head when we get into integral. But that's where identity starts, is in a first tier genealogical. And it's the same with me today. Yes, if my biology is threatened, I've got something that's life-threatening medically, I'm finding the best doctor I can find to see if something can be done about it ASAP, or I can extend my life as long as I possibly can. That's my instinctive self given to me by God to do that. But I'm also tribal, just like tribal values. And that is, if we're here at the conference and we got a phone call that something had happened, serious accident or something had happened to one of the kids, everything stops. You're going to stop what you're doing. Spouse, loved one, your tribal instinct is going to kick in, and you're going to be very protective. Why? Because it's God-given. That you have that God-given tribal instinct. That's just who we are and how we operate. In this stage, when the world was primarily tribal, one of the other values they had related to magic. What you find in this age are volcano gods, or God in the thunderstorm, or God in the river. A lot of magic. Spiral consultants, who again just use this for examples, not religious, will say, today you might find this in parts of the world where they do voodoo. That's a tribal type concept. And what you'll find is in the people here that are using voodoo, you'll find a lot of other tribal V-meme traits. And when you talk with them, you're not going to come in at some higher level and say, hey, that's silly. You can't start the conversation there. You've got to start where they are. What's page appropriate? Well, when I go to the biblical narrative, that's a pretty easy one. After we get into Adam, then to Genesis, there's one other character that shows up in the Genesis of the story. Abraham. There's the two guys that start this, and they're going to start a dynamic, a dialectic. A dialectic that's going to pull against each other and continue to produce new worldviews. It's really cool. So what do we call Abraham? Father Abraham. Why? Tribal. His grandson, Israel, it was Jacob, right? Then Jacob's name is changed to Israel. 12 sons become the 12 tribes. So you go in the genesis of the story from archaic Adam, individual, into tribal thinking. And when you talk about magic gods and whatever, what is it that you read about all the time at the beginning in the biblical narrative? Everybody had idols. What's the deal with that? They all had idols. And idolatry was huge. You shall have no other gods before me. Idolatry was huge. What happened the minute Moses goes off to have this amazing Sinai experience? They get tired of waiting, they build a golden calf. They go back to the type of idols that they knew from Egypt. Why? When I was in Sunday school, I was like, man, those people are so stupid. They just didn't get it. Well, if I had lived back then, I would have probably been, hey, what can I do to help? And that's why Israel was warned about idolatry. Today, that still exists. I don't know if anybody in here is to magic crystals and other things that people have, or there's also religions that are very much statue, etc., oriented towards sacred, or even sacred sites, places that are sacred. When I grew up, for example, the church building was sacred. And you know how you have these viewpoints that supposedly come from Scripture. When Paul said in the Scriptures, do you not have homes to eat and drink in? My denomination took that as, you can't eat in the church building. That was their belief. I don't know if any of you ever been through somebody. Their belief was you can't eat. Now, for some reason, we were allowed to have a water fountain. That's, but you didn't question. And we'll see why you didn't question a little bit in these worldviews. So you start with that, and so you're really starting with identity as ethnocentric in the beginning rather. When we get all the way up to integral, the biblical narrative is going to say God moved humanity from ethnocentric to world-centric. And it's a process. It's a growing up process that humans have experienced all these things because it's part of who we are at our base and still are when we're talking about being tribal. Now, Abraham received two promises. The first promise was, of you I'm going to make a great nation. Promise number one. Promise number two, through you, Father Abraham, I am going to bless all nations of the earth. First tier, second tier. Ethnocentric, world-centric. Why? Because Israel was very much ethnocentric in her experiences. God had to work through and call Israel, not because she was going to go through history as the one particular people forever and ever, but because that's where you have to start in tribal, with something that's tribal. And so he started with Israel and called her out as a model of these first worldviews, but not the end of all worldviews. And so it starts. That's how the story starts. We got Abraham, we got Adam. Now, Abraham, he's also known for faith, the faith of Abraham. That is going to be the other dynamic that sits over against the self-instinctive grasping of Adam, wanting to grasp. In the metaphorical story of the fruit, the apple, it symbolizes him trying to grasp, to be like God. Abraham was dealing by faith. So what was the difference? Adam wanted the knowledge. He wanted to know. That's human instinct. Our ancestors wanted to know what might be out there when it got dark. We have a fear of the unknown. We all do. What might happen? We run through scenarios through our head at night. What might happen? What might happen? Oh gosh, if this happens, what are we going to do? And that's because we were all ignorant at a young age and had children. See, this is the way evolution works. You don't know any better. We love our children. Well, Adam wanted to know. That's instinctive, self-inward pull. But the narrative says Abraham was called to go out into a place, and he went not knowing. I need to know faith. I'm going to go not knowing on faith. That's a twofold dialectic that's going to be at play all the way up to the garden in Jesus. The war of the instinctive survival self and what it means to crucify the self. We'll talk about more and more as we go along, but it all starts in the beginning of how we are as humans. So you have this twofold with Abraham and with Adam. All of these are God-given roles and functions. And the journey of faith starts with Abraham, but there's a verse in Romans 1, it's actually verse 17. Paul makes this interesting statement. He says, the righteousness of God is being revealed from faith to faith. And then he immediately, in the next few chapters, goes into Abraham. From the faith of Abraham to the faith of Christ is the story of God. And it's the evolution of faith. Faith started with Abraham, but it had some growing to do. It had a lot of things it had to discover, as we'll see through these different eras of history, to where we could really get to a place where Jesus could come in the fullness of time, the fullness of first tier. And it had accomplished all these things, And now people were really ready to understand what the faith of Christ was about versus where it started with the faith of Abraham. That's my take. I'm doing a lot of talking. By the way, that's awful close to raising your hand. You know you've got your elbow, so be real careful. And again, so if there's thoughts, questions, insights, please. And I've got my iPhone here because when I go to these things, I want to know when is the next break and what time do we eat. I'm an Enneagram 9. So if you know the Enneagram, you know we need snacks. And my wife knows me. This is why our marriage works so well. She knows me inside out. So that trajectory, when you get out to Hebrews 11, you know, that's where you've got all the Hebrews, the heroes of faith. And the Hebrew writers, like all the way back to Daniel, and they faced the lions, and these people did this, and by faith Rahab helped the spies, and by faith this person did this, and by faith this person. But the writer of Hebrews ends the chapter by saying, all these died in faith, not yet having received the promises, because God had something in store that we are going to experience. And that is the faith of Christ. That's where faith was going. Now, what does that mean? Well, we're going to keep unpacking the difference in the way faith is, because for example, you can say faith is a requirement for you to be accepted by God. You have faith, brother? You got faith, sister? Yes, I do. Okay, that's good. So what denomination do you go to? Tell me about that faith. Do you guys believe in the incarnation? Tell me more about your faith. Do you guys believe you have to be baptized to be saved? Tell me more about your faith. See, this is where, you say, we've got faith, but then we begin a new discussion. I'm going to propose that the narrative at the end of all this, in an integrated God, is going to stress that the source of human identity is God and God alone. And that we humans, all 8 billions of us, represent 8 billion different pages of understanding. And when you get into the business of judgment, and being the one who writes the rule book, we'll talk about that and how that may or may not apply today. So, transcend and include. Let's talk now about the warrior. Warrior is the red, that's a great color for warrior. It's the red value meme. What came in the warrior era? How did that happen? Well, in the earliest times of history, human beings were pretty limited on where their tribe could be located. If there was a big river, the early tribes may not have had any way to navigate to go on the other side of the river or up over a mountain range. And so they're pretty localized. And there are tribes dotted all over the planet in certain places. They never encounter each other. But as human populations expanded, then tribes encountered each other. And what did they find out? These people have strange gods. These people have strange practices. These people have got to be converted to the right way and so what happened was you had tribal conflicts, and it was a power age. It was all about power, red power. Today, the consultants in the world of law and order started in some groups that use spiral dynamics in New Orleans and some different programs that are going on. they will say that to work with and understand gangs, you have to really understand the depth of the warrior culture worldview. Gangs operate on warrior level. Respect, huge. It's all about power. It's all about being for yourself. And as Claire Graves literally said, and to hell with others. That's warrior. You want to survive, you want the power, and you're constantly watching your back. Well, the warrior age, you end up with Attila the Hun and Vikings, and you end up with what's called feudal kingdoms. It's constant, because it's a mix of people that are coming together with different views. Those of us that have been married for a while, a simple, not too serious example. First year you're married. Well, you know, my family does Christmas every year on Christmas Day at our house. And we open our presents Christmas morning. And I say, well, that's weird. Our family, no, we have a big dinner Christmas Eve. We like to open our presents on Christmas Eve and sleep in. And thus it starts. You begin to realize, wait a minute, I married someone that thinks differently than I do. And then for the first time you wonder, oh man, what's their problem? And of course, the longer you're married, you find out they've got way more problems than that. So we know that this is what happens when we think about warrior conflict. It's worldviews colliding, the worldviews of tribal conflict that were happening. And if I look at the biblical narrative, one of the books that I would point to for the warrior worldview is the book of Judges. Rated R. It's got a lot of violence in it. Probably not a book that you've thought about lately. Not a good icebreaker at a party, really. But the book of Judges, one of the things that I did not mention is that the warrior age then, because it was power in the individual, was heroes, Hercules and Attila and these other, the one with power, had these great power people, because that's respect and that's what survival is all about in the warrior age. Well, what do you get in Judges? You get Samson. He's the hero. He's the power guy. He can go around and wreak havoc on those poor Philistines. And you read about it in Bible class. Oh, yeah. But the other thing was, it was in Israel's warrior age that she was on the way to Canaan, and as she entered, looking through the red lens, the God she saw and the God she heard was that those that do not worship false gods and whatever, when you go into that city, destroy them all. Very disturbing. I mean, how many times have you had people, or maybe yourself, wonder, why is it that God seems so mean? And it's always the wrath of God, the wrath of God. It's a lens through which they understood God. And as we're going to see before we become too critical of Israel in that, there's a lot of other lenses we're going to encounter that involve religion. And they come all the way out to today, where no, we don't kill people. We go on the internet and do character assassination. You know, that's our way of dealing from a warrior standpoint. But in Judges, for example, I was reading a story about a conflict between two feudal groups. And so the king saw he was going to be defeated. He ran to what he thought was someone that was a friendly ally. He was exhausted, so they said, here, go in this tent and sleep and rest. But his wife did not think the same way. His wife was worried for their own safety because she knew this guy was bad news. So the book of Judges says that she went into the tent while he was asleep. She took a tent peg, she put it to his temple, and she drove the tent through his skull, and it literally went into the ground. That's R. That's rated R. It's not the kind of thing you want to put on a flannel board for the children. Oh, look, yeah, what's that, teacher? Oh, cool! They'd be like, I know that they know the book of Judges inside out. They'd be telling you stories. At this point, let me say this about the colors that we're going to see as we go along. You move from the cool colors. What are the cool? Mean literally, instead of hot, cool. Tribal is cool. You move to warrior, those are warm. Red is warm. You move back to traditional, blue is cool. You move into modernity, it's orange, it's a warm color. You go to post-modernity green, it's a cool. Why is that? Because what you're going to see is that the ones that are the warm colors have to do with deconstructing the previous stage. And the stages that come after the warm colors settle into a stable societal, cultural existence for some amount of time. Because human beings are always looking to find stability. We see the Middle East and what's happening and the atrocities. Well, consultants in the Middle East, I'll bring up two. We had Saeed Dalabani and Elza Malouf come and talk with us because they are consultants in the Middle East between Palestinians and Israelis. And they're real close. They learned all of it from Don Beck. So I said, hey, we'd love to have you come and talk to presidents about the way spiral values are playing themselves out in the Middle East. These tribal conflicts. This is tribal. This is warrior. This is genealogy. This is the beginning of the biblical narrative. Can you come and tell us what your conversations are today among the Palestinians and among the Israelis? Well, they worked with groups that were not part of the power hierarchy. They were working with people who were moms and dads, children of concern, wanting the best for raising up their children, educating. And so they were getting a lot of great interaction that they hoped was going to lead to the power players. And that showed me that once again, all of these things, all of these levels, warrior, et cetera, they're all at play still in different parts of the world. There are places in Africa, for example, where the tribal is very much at play. Presence as kind of a sidebar. I need a snack pretty soon. Plus coffee is always a good thing, fresh air to get through. On the deconstruction side, I began to realize that it played a necessary role to deconstruct previous views. We'll get into deconstruction a lot more because you guys have been through it. BCM has been through deconstruction. We're going to talk about it a lot more later. So I will get to that and how that works. So anyway, Elza and Saeed went through that with us, and we went through with them biblical narrative things. Were we supposed to end at 10:30? Okay.
Whatever you want.
At what?
Whenever you want to take a break.
Yeah, I'm going to take one in just a second. Because this is going to be a good break point. Because once we get into the next three, traditional, modern, postmodern, that all exists right now. It has existed for millennia, well, actually since the Egyptian Empire, all the way up through the Romans, what Jesus encounters, and all the way up to today. That's where it gets more fun. This is the part that's like you're sitting in a history class or something. But I bring it up to say that as I talk to these people that are consultants in different areas about the way this is seeming to work its way out in the biblical narrative, and they are not people, they're not Christians. I don't even know if they're Saeed and Elsa even practiced any religion. But they validated the way these worldviews seem to be working out in the narrative. And as I went all the way on up through Integral, some interesting things are always said with people that come from outside of religion. One of the first things they'll say to me is, does anybody else believe that? And I'll be like, yeah, there's like 400 or 500. No, there's more than that. I mean, now I know you guys, and you know a lot of that. So I mean, I can say, and I know people in Colorado that out there that are way out there. And then it's that, and then they want to know, you know, what resistance, what are the conversations, etc. So that's how I've really gone through people, trying to give you a feel for people that are in different things. I've talked to people in global finance. They're using spiral dynamics. It all started with Occupy Wall Street. That's unhealthy orange. We'll get to it later. Healthy, unhealthy. And so that's spiral dynamics, and they use spiral dynamics. And they're looking at healthy capitalism. We're going to talk about hierarchies. Hierarchies have done a lot of damage. So should we discard them? We're going to talk about that in our next session. So let me make sure I don't have anything else to say about the warrior. I do not. So when we pick it up again, I'm going to do the next three, and there's more to say about them anyway, and I'm hoping I can get some interaction from you all and your thoughts on these next three. So I'm going to end it from here. Let's take our break, John.
Yeah.
Then we'll pick it up, what, 15 or so?